previous session, we discussed the challenges and dilemmas when doing research on terrorism and counterterrorism. And in an earlier video, we showed the enormous increase in studies, centers, researchers in the field of terrorism studies after 9/11. But what insights has this boom produced? And the most important question, do we know much more about terrorism and counterterrorism than before 9/11? The answers to these questions by some of the leading scholars in the field show a relatively critical attitude towards the products of the study of terrorism. But in more recent statements, they seem to be rather positive about the kind of research that has been done in recent years. Well, this is what they have to say. Andrew Silke, for instance, who in 2004 wrote a very critical book about the results of terrorism studies in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, noticed in 2009 that the field of terrorism studies is beginning to stabilize from the biases in focus in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and the war on terror. And Magnus Ranstorp, who is affiliated with the Swedish National Defense College, expressed the need for vigorous debates, critical self-reflexivity and alternative analytical assumptions and approaches. And the third quote, more recent one, is from Alex Schmid, who amongst others is a fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism here in The Hague. Well, he's rather positive about latest developments. In 2011 he wrote, and we're very happy with that, he said that terrorism studies has never been in a better shape than now. Looking at these statements and having studied other works that look into the state of the art in my field of study, the following issues stand out. These are main characteristics, including both strong points and weaker points, and one of them is the focus on niches. A lot of terrorism researchers look into very specific types of terrorism or modus operandi. A good example of that is the interest in terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. A lot of books, articles, reports have been published about that. But it's really not the type of terrorism that takes place most of the time. It's a very worrisome development, but some say too much attention has been focused on that. Another example is lone wolf terrorism or lone operator terrorism. Very interesting. Many people remember the horrible attack in Norway by Anders Breivik. We want to know, what motivates these people, why they do it, what can we do against it. But if we look at all incidents on terrorism, this is such a marginal phenomenon. It represents less than 1% of all attacks. Maybe it's only 0.1%. So we have to be careful. Do we devote a lot of attention to these very specific types of terrorism, however interesting they are, or do we focus on the terrorism that most countries deal with every day? A second characteristic of the state-of-the-art of terrorism and counterterrorism studies is the fact that it's based on the assumption that terrorism is a very big threat, that terrorism constitutes of major attacks. And if we look at the facts, we see that in most countries it's not a big physical threat, and that most terrorist attacks are not of the scale of 9/11, Bombay or other major events. An issue of concern is the characteristic that the state-of-the-art of terrorism studies is not focusing on comparative studies and that there's few theory testing. This is a problem. I'll come back to that later. And we're going to do something about it. We're going to actually compare theory and practice, something that needs to be done more according to many scholars in the field of terrorism studies. And next is the issue of the selection bias to Western interest. Well, I've already given the example of Pakistan. Much attention to the threat posed by terrorism from Pakistan to the West, and much less attention how terrorism affects Pakistan and Pakistani. And another characteristic is the policy-oriented nature of research. Well, actually, I think that's a positive side of the state-of-the-art of terrorism studies. There's been much research into questions that authorities have, governments have, how to deal with this threat. And much of the studies tried at least to give an answer to that, providing studies to questions that are relevant, especially in the field of counter-terrorism. And then the fundamental question. Do we know much more about terrorism and counter-terrorism than, let's say, 12 years ago? I think the answer is yes. Yes, we do know much more. But of course there are and under-researched issues, topics that still need to be addressed. And for a list of them, see the link to the journal Perspectives on Terrorism, which you find in the recommended readings. To sum up, we do know more about terrorism, and academia and think tanks have produced interesting assumptions on causes, mechanisms and processes regarding terrorism and counter-terrorism. But we also notice that there has been a lack of theory testing and the testing of assumptions. And that's not a good thing. Why not? These assumptions are very often the basis of counter-terrorism policies. So if the assumptions are right, that's a good thing. But if the assumptions are wrong, maybe our counter-terrorism policies are wrong. So we need to test them. And that's what we're going to do. We have selected 5 interesting assumptions, either because they're challenged or the opposite, they're very much trusted and the basis of policy making. Well, these 5 assumptions are the following. First is, terrorism is caused by poverty. Or terrorists are crazy. Terrorism is increasingly lethal. And the last 2 are, terrorism is predominantly anti-Western and terrorism is successful. Well, is it? What about these assumptions? Are they true, partly true, false, or do we have to qualify them as myth? That's what we're going to discuss next week.